Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest runs her own book coaching and editing company. Her name is Sue Toth, and my interview with Sue will follow the teleportation sound. Sue Toth, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay. I'm Sue Toth, and I am an editor and a book coach. And my goal is to help your author dreams come to life. I help you at any stage in the writing process, and I help with editing your book. And I'm sure that we will have lots of questions about that you'll learn a lot more about me as this time goes on.
You run your own book editing and book coaching business. What services does your business provide to authors, and what is your business called?
It's called Sue Toth Editing Services. And the two main services that I provide are first book coaching, which happens for an author at any point during their writing process. There's lots of different things that book coaching involves, which I can get into more in a little bit. And then the other piece of my business is editing, and I specialize mostly in developmental editing, which is the overall big picture of the book. We look at story arcs, we look at plot holes, we look at characters and setting and how they all contribute to the story as a whole.
Who are some authors that you've provided editing, coaching, or both of those services to?
I work mostly with independent authors. One that people can find several of her books that I've worked on Amazon is a woman named Susan Specht-Oram, and she writes domestic suspense books. And she has a whole series that are all set in a town in the state of Washington. And I've worked on her books, so I've done a lot. In addition to the coaching and editing, we've also talked a lot about continuity with those books.
What motivated you to become a book coach and book editor?
Oh, that's a fun story. I've always loved to read. I was the kid who, back in the days before Kindles, I had the book and the flashlight under the covers when I was in bed at night and I was supposed to be sleeping, and I was reading my book with my flashlight. I have burned dinner because I've been in the middle of a good book and I forgot that something was on the stove. I once forgot to pick my son up from basketball practice because I was in the middle of a good book and just forgot what time it was, so I didn't leave on time. I worked in journalism, and prior to that, I always loved English classes in school, in grammar school, high school, and college. I always loved them. And I worked in journalism for a long time. And the way I got into book editing was this. I had met a woman who wrote a book, and I was doing a feature story on her for the news outlet that I was working for at the time. So she asked me if I would like to read her book, and I said, of course. And I read it, and I did see issues, things that I thought could be changed and made a little bit better. And so when I came back to her afterwards and we were going to talk about the book for the article, she said, well, what did you think of it? And I told her kind of politely, because I wasn't asked to edit this book, so I didn't want to assume she wanted my commentary. So she said, no, tell me, you're a journalist, you're a teacher, what did you think? So I started to tell her the issues that I saw, and she said, you're brilliant. You really should be a book editor. Well, the rest is history, as the old saying goes. I worked with her for a good long time, and then I started my business and started actively finding clients on my own.
What is a book? Okay. I'll go ahead and ask this question, even though you kind of touched on it. What is a book coach, and what does a book coach do?
Okay. I did touch on it, but not in enough detail. You're right. People hire a book coach for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're stuck There might be a plot point that they're just not able to get past, or they're not sure what to do with a character, or they have this whole overall story and they just don't know which direction to go in with it. I can come in and help there. I can help them with an outline. We can just talk about characters or plot or whatever it is that is, getting to them that they can't get past, and I help them get past it. Sometimes people have issues with motivation to keep on working. So I provide motivational tools as well to get them through a time where they're just feeling like, oh my gosh, I just don't know if this book is good. I don't know if I want to be working on it anymore. I'll help them get past that. I'll help them with writer's block if they're completely stuck, as I've said before. If they're stuck on something, sometimes all it takes is talking with another person who really understands your book to get you past those stuck points. And that's what a coach does.
Why would an author need a book coach?
For a lot of those reasons that I said, but mostly I think to get themselves unstuck, to get themselves past a point where they just don't know where to go. They just, I don't know what to do with this thing. How should I make this character work with the other characters? Or, I have this plot and it could go two different ways and I just don't know. I need a piece of advice. Oftentimes authors will use a coach because they'll want somebody completely unbiased looking at their work and helping them with their work. Many times authors will go to a friend and say, can you read this for me? And a friend will say, oh my gosh, it's so good. It's wonderful. But that's because they're a friend. Sometimes what an author really needs the most is an unbiased set of eyes. And that's what I can provide.
I'm going to pivot to your other service, which is book editing. What different types of book editing are there? And do you specialize in any single type or a couple of types of editing?
There are several, and yes, I do. So let me start with your first question. The types of editing, there's actually four. So the first one and the biggest picture one is called developmental editing. And that is when an editor looks at the entire picture of a book. It's a completed book usually, which is the difference, by the way, between book coaching and editing. A coach will work with a book along the way, and editor generally wants to see a completed book. But in developmental editing, we'll look at the whole story. Does the story work? Does the pacing work? Is it going too fast in some spots or too slow in some spots? Do the characters interact well with one another? Do they make sense? Are there any plot holes? Like, do you just skip a period of time within the story and we have no idea what happened or where the characters were during that time? Those are the big things that a developmental editor will look at. Then there's also line editing. That's the next step down. And that really works with the sentence structure. It makes sure the sentences are varied in length. Do the sentences make sense? Do they make sense for the time period that they're in? And I can give you an example of that. I worked with an author once who was writing a book set in the early 1920s. And there were two young men that were greeting each other at a party. They were young, rather wealthy men. And one said to the other, yo, what's up? Now, in the 1920s, people didn't speak that way. And especially more wealthy men didn't speak that way. So I pointed that out to the author and said, I think we need to use something a little bit more 1920s appropriate here. Those are the sorts of things a line editor does. Copy editing is when you look for the errors on the page. Are the paragraphs broken up correctly? Is the punctuation in the right place? Are there quote marks around everything that a speaker is actually saying? Are the words all spelled correctly? Do you have a character's name that's maybe spelled in different ways in different instances throughout the manuscript? That's what copy editing looks for. And then the very final stage is proofreading. And that generally comes when the manuscript has already been typeset and it looks like it's in book form. It will generally be in a PDF file as opposed to a Word file. And it's set up to look just like it will look when the book is printed. And in the proofreading process, you're looking for things like, did a line get dropped from the bottom of the page to the top of the next? Did the line get repeated from the bottom of one page to the top of the next? Are all the page numbers correct? Are all the running heads correct? That's the kind of stuff that proofreading looks for. I specialize in developmental and line editing. I will do, and I can do and will do all of them. But the two I specialize in are developmental and line editing. And I also highly recommend that you do not use the same person for any more than two of those services.
I have the next question written up. I'm going to do this kind of more as a follow-up to the last point you made. Why should, when an author goes to look for editors for their work, why should they not use the same editor for every type of book editing?
Okay, that's a very good question. As a developmental editor, I will read a book as few as 3 times, as many as 5 or 6. And that, depends on how much work it needs and how much the author wants to discuss things with me after the edit is completed. If I see a copy edit while I'm doing developmental editing, I will fix it, but that's not my main purpose in editing the book at that point. The more important fact, though, is that by the time I have read it anywhere between, say, 3 and 6 times, I'm going to miss things because I know what it's supposed to say. And in my head, that's what it says, even if the word "the" is there twice or a word is missing or something like that. You need, at that point, you need a fresh set of eyes, because a fresh set of eyes is always going to catch something that the last pair of eyes did not.
Why aren't word processor spell checking functions like, say, the spell check that's built into Microsoft Word or Google Docs or Scrivener or other similar applications, as well as services like Grammarly? Why aren't those a replacement for people who edit books?
They are an accompaniment to editors. They are not a replacement for editors. Sometimes if a word is spelled correctly, even if it's not the right word choice for that particular instance, that's a grammar and a spell check isn't necessarily going to pick it up. If you've spelled an author's name a character's name a couple of different ways, not going to pick that up. If your main character had brown eyes in chapter 1 and blue eyes in chapter 3, nobody's going to pick that up. No program is going to pick that up. A person has to look at those sorts of things. And sometimes you have what Grammarly would consider a mistake, but it's not a mistake because you might be using a certain dialect in your dialogue, or you may have made a certain editorial choice because of the setting or the time period of your book. And an editor needs to look through those things and make sure that they know what's going on. They know what your exceptions are. And they also know that your main character was supposed to have brown eyes throughout the entire book.
On the website for your editing and coaching business, which I will provide a link to in the text description of the episode once this episode's uploaded, there's a feature called Research Tips for Fiction Authors that includes some blog-style posts. Feel free to tell us more about that page on your site.
Okay. Well, I have a blog post page, and I have a lot of different blogs on topics. And one of the topics that I write about is research and how important research is to the fiction writer. When you are discussing or describing a scene, you want it to be as true to life as it can be. So if you are discussing what happens, like if there's a murdered body, what is the first thing the police do when they come onto the scene? And if you have them just walking around touching things with their hands and you don't have them putting gloves on, readers are going to pick up on that and they're going to say, they're contaminating this whole scene. These are the sorts of things that an author has to research before they write about it, because you want your story to be as true to life as it possibly can be. And you don't want people to come at you saying, oh, well, you know, your character's a detective and this is what detectives always do. And your detective didn't do it. So why not? What it all comes down to, all of this, research, editing, book coaching, it all comes down to making your book the best it can possibly be. Because if it's not, as we all know, books are sold on Amazon, which is a big place where people buy them, and people go to Goodreads for recommendations for books. And if your book gets a bad review in either of those places, you can kind of kiss it goodbye. It's not going to be bought by a lot of people. And you've done all this hard work to come up with a story and put it together. You don't want to derail the whole thing because you didn't research one particular point, or you didn't send it through a copy editor and there's tons of mistakes in it. That is pretty much why I recommend everything that I do, because it comes down to reader satisfaction. And if you don't have that, you're not going to have a career as an author.
I have one final question for this interview. Have you thought about writing a book of your own? And if so, what are some ideas for books that you may write?
Yes, I have. I am actually currently working on a couple of different, very short ebooks on different parts of the editing process. How to handle characterization and how to handle plot are the two that I'm currently working on. I have always had the idea for a rock star romance floating around in my head. I have not put it down on paper yet. And the reason I haven't is mostly because I think there are other people who are simply amazing writers. And I think that my superpower is to edit, not necessarily to write. It's what I love to do best. It's how I feel I can help the process the most, and it's what I enjoy the most.
Sue, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You are an amazing guest.
Well, thank you. It was such a pleasure to be here.
Sue was an amazing and insightful guest to interview. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.